Yeah, thank you, Justine. I'm Carolin. I'm a research fellow at Nottingham Trent University, where I've also been working with the Changing Futures project on their evaluation and research projects, and then also been doing my PhD at King's College London on how women navigate access to support and services. So today I'll be speaking more specifically about some findings that have come out of this, but I'll also give you, because we've got a bit of time, an overview of what I've been generally doing and some ideas that have come out of it. So as Justine has said, I'm hoping to have more of a discussion maybe around it and hear your thoughts, because I think that I'm still developing some of these findings, and I'm really curious to hear your insights from your practice and how they kind of resonate with your with your experiences. So as I said, more generally, the presentation will be about the role of violence when women navigate homelessness and how they then often rely on informal networks to cope with the violence and navigate homelessness. To give you a very brief background, but I'm sure you're all aware, there's rising numbers of homelessness, not just in Nottingham, but also across the country and more internationally. And they're often coupled with financial constraints. There's a lack of, or a decrease maybe, or decommissioning of certain services, despite the increase of people placed in temporary accommodation. There's also been a high number of drug-related overdoses, and some practitioners having spoke about rampant mental ill health. We can also see record numbers of people sleeping rough in the city, and that has kind of had a knock-on effect on certain homelessness services, a potentially more rigid application of rules, dispersal orders, quicker move-on options, and maybe less flexible working. Nevertheless, Nottingham is doing has SMD, so severe and multiple disadvantage and homelessness often as a priority across local papers. Domestic abuse and violence is a very prevalent trigger for homelessness among women, so that now when women apply for housing assistance, the statutory go to statutory housing services, they're meant to be prioritized for housing assistance, and so that could have kind of impacted the increase in women in temporary housing that we're seeing, alongside probably lots of more structural reasons and barriers that we're seeing, and that has then also led to an increase in research and practice, more specialist services in for women experiencing homelessness, which I've seen popping up across the country and also in Nottingham. And the research that is now investigating women's homelessness is often still keeps pointing at the prevalence of violence, not just domestic abuse, but also sexual abuse and violence. And there's some studies that have found, using national data, for example, that 20% of women who had experienced violence became homeless, compared to less than 1%. So violence being a very big trigger of homelessness amongst women. We also know that experiences of violence are probably intersectional, and we don't know enough about it yet, but there's some evidence that people from certain ethnic minority groups and LGBTQ populations experiencing higher rates of abuse and often finding it more difficult to secure housing after leaving an abusive partner. There's also questions around the visibility, and I think you had another webinar a few weeks ago which kind of spoke about it, to what extent are women's experiences potentially less visible because they're safer surfing, because they're staying with an abusive partner, and so on. But I think, and in my presentation will show that a little bit as well, that there are a lot of women that are quite visible within services. But I think we also see a lot how the system is currently often failing people experiencing multiple disadvantage, including women. For example, if you look at domestic abuse and violence, that there's still women that are being turned away from housing assistance because they're unable to prove, for example, the evidence of having had experience of domestic abuse and violence, even though that's that shouldn't be the case for the Domestic Abuse Act account, and that often like reinforces social exclusions, those women staying in violent situations for longer and more likely to exhaust, potentially more likely to exhaust informal options before seeking formal support. And my PhD in general is more broadly investigating women's access to support and care, and just looking at exactly these barriers. How are the like intersectionals of being a woman, being a migrant, being a lone mother, a lone parent from an ethnic minority group, identifying as LGBTQ+, having a disability or long-term conditions. How is that like shaping their access to support and services? And yeah, how are these kind of that different dimensions intersecting when women are seeking help and support? And in order to do this, I've used several methods. I've done lots of participant observations in different voluntary and statutory services. So I attended drop-ins, shadowed practitioners, attended some case conference meetings, and just like seeing how organizations and practitioners interact with women using their services. I'm not going to name the services just to like keep some anonymity for the services that were involved, and because I do know people tend to know like who are the different, like I mean probably quite aware of like some of the services that I may be speaking about, so I try to keep it as broad as possible to kind of keep people's anonymity. And same for the interviews. And when using quotes, I won't be giving any like demographic information that could potentially identify someone, or I'll leave out certain bits and may have slightly altered some experiences they had. So as I mentioned, I also conducted semi-structured qualitative interviews with some of the women accessing services, and did follow-up interviews with about half of the women after 6 months. So in total, I interviewed 14 participants. 37 of them identified as women or female, 2 as trans, and 1 as non-binary. The range was kind of between 22 and 60, but most of the women that I interviewed were like, I'd say like around 30 and 45 maybe. And I interviewed 14 staff within these services. And as you can see here as well, like the number of LGBTQ people in my sample are quite underrepresented. And so that the presentation of these findings now will probably be more specific on women, but we can like in the discussion talk a little bit maybe about some of the differences that I observed, especially towards trans women. The women that I interviewed for my project, but also I also tried to interview quite a wide range of women from like different backgrounds, different types of homelessness they were experiencing. So that also kind of impacted the different services that were involved. And again, this is quite a simplified version of how of the services that were involved with, the different services that were involved with. And the services that they accessed. And I did find that there were differences, especially depending on whether they were using substances, whether they had dependent children or not, and whether they were born in this country and had like English as a second language. But there were also like more subtle differences, I think, depending on intersectional dimensions of how they used services or not. The ones in yellow were the ones where I mainly recruited from, where like women were more likely to be engaged with. There were also several routes into homelessness that were mentioned, and I'm not really going over them, but they're just like highlight that they were quite different routes potentially, and that they often also sometimes also interacted with each other, or they were quite cyclical as well, that maybe in some cases, or that they were connected in some cases, or that cyclical in terms of like they managed to get like a housing or some stability for a while, and then something else happened. So they're not like exclusive. And in some cases also we find where local authority, I did find some people telling me about experiences where local authority had a duty to assist, but didn't, and people and women felt often let down by the services, which often was, or which I found was more often the case when people were not born in the UK in English and didn't have English as a first language, which made it more difficult to like access the information and navigate the system. But the system in general was quite complex to navigate for everyone. And that brings me to like some of the preliminary findings that have emerged so far. And what I just mentioned with the system, for example, what I found is that lots of the women that I spoke to perceived the services, and especially statutory services, as quite inaccessible. And so that led to the kind of almost need to have some advocacy or like a support worker or a practitioner that was really dedicated and like helped them to navigate access to support. There's also, especially for women, and even more so if there's like more intersectional dimensions such as like race, ethnicity, disability, not being born in this country and not speaking English as a first language, which led to like a lack of housing and difficulties accessing the housing because there's not enough specialist services especially now in the constrained kind of service context that we're seeing. And I'm still kind of like trying to draw the more gender specific barriers here, but I did find that it was often experiences were often influenced by the way maybe we like perceive vulnerability, and that often had like a gender dimensions of like when women were like smiley, or like there was some practitioners felt that they needed more emotional kind of caretaking maybe than men, which sometimes were perceived as being like more transactional. And so some of these things we're going to talk about more in depth today, like experiences of violence, for example, tend to be quite gendered. And then what I've just mentioned now, the maybe lack of like relational support when services don't have much time anymore to build the relationships with people in general. So this is like an example of, again, a slightly altered timeline of one of the women that I spoke to, and it kind of shows that these kind of like cyclical nature, maybe a little bit of like how homelessness often maybe started with a triggering event or like a traumatic event. In many of these cases was also linked to like childhood trauma, and even though I didn't specifically ask in the interviews about childhood trauma, it often did come up, and I think and it often came up also in the way it kind of influenced help seeking later on, and they like being let down by services came out of these interviews a lot, which kind of shaped experiences of feeling quite lonely and isolated, and not feeling like they be able to trust services because they've been let down so many times, and then trying to like find other ways to navigate homelessness, like through silver surfing, which we can see in Kelly's journey here. Or having been in an institution and being released without any support. Some of the women that I spoke to were also care leavers, which is also a risk factor for homelessness in general, and then again being released without any proper support. And in many of these timelines as well, it's not just negative. Also, many spoke about positive experiences, and again, that was often when practitioners have been able to build positive relationships, have been able to like, or have been like responding empathetically with an understanding and taking the time to actually hear and engage with women. So in one of the aspects that I just mentioned that we'll be talking more about today is that kind of like how women develop resilience and developed informal survival strategy when they felt like all the doors were closed towards more from service responses. So how experiences of violence, and particularly the normalization of violence that often happened, led to women rely more on social networks, which in itself were often precarious. That's why the title precarious capital. So often even like options perceived as safer were often exploitative and unsafe. And so there were was often quite a dynamic between trying to like reclaim agencies, but then often the opportunities that were available to them were unsafe. Yeah, so as I mentioned, like the next few slides are now going to be about that topic in particular that became quite apparent in my observations and the research finding, like the impact of violence and the relational impact this may have had, meaning how women seek out different relationships with practitioners, but also family partners and friends or associates to kind of navigate and minimize risks of violence and homelessness. So that's super important for the presentation now, but just to analyze the data, I looked into the theory and what other people have done to like conceptualize agency and social relationships and help seeking. And so I used that also for my thesis and for these findings in particular to kind of give like my findings a bit more structure and analyze relational dynamics between social barriers, personal experiences, and also the intersectional inequalities or dimensions that may appear and how they may kind of depend on the context they're in and navigating the homelessness field. And we do know that social support can serve as a motivation or a buffer against homelessness and can mitigate risks and adversity. So, for example, when people are sofa surfing and trying to rely on like more informal strategies to kind of prevent slipping rough. But we also know that, especially in with the example of sofa surfing, for example, this can also lead to further sexual and economic exploitation and violence. And often these informal survival strategies actually show similar health risks than other forms of homelessness, such as when people are sleeping rough. Yeah, so in the following, I will highlight some of the connections that women possessed and formed, and how based on these connections, they often made decisions about support and how in their context in which the use of like these different relationships were often compromised. And so now these specific findings are drawn on 28 of the 40 participants that I interviewed, and only the 28 who have specifically mentioned experiences of homelessness and gender-based violence. So that includes sexual, domestic, but also institutional, meaning when they received like dismissive responses for the violence that occurred against them, or or when their experiences were used against them, but they were often intertwined with other experiences of gender-based violence. And that also doesn't mean that the other 12 participants that I interviewed didn't make any, haven't made experiences of violence and abuse, but they may have just not mentioned it to me. And I think the group of women that I do draw on here could also be probably seen as quite at high risk due to the multiple needs that many of them were experiencing. So that included substance use, but also being a mother, being a lone mother, being pregnant, and engaging in sex work. And they were also they were recruited the same way as for my general thesis. So from the services that I were involved with, and I also included some insights from the practitioners that I interviewed for that project. And the demographics for the women experiencing violence more specifically were slightly younger, maybe between 22 and 51 years, but the rest of it was quite similar to compared to the whole sample of women that I interviewed. A third had been living in hostels at the time of the interview, which is probably due to my recruitment strategy, where I went a lot into hostels and recruited women from there, but I also went to drop-ins, day centres and so on, where I recruited women who were sofa serving, staying with someone in exchange for sex, crack houses, squatting, supported accommodation, and 4 had already moved into accounts of that, but had recently been homeless. More than half identified as white British, with the other half being like roughly divided across different ethnicities. And as I mentioned, or in this particular sample, there were also 2 trans women included, but because it was because it was majority women who identified as cis women, the study will also mostly focus on the experience of cis women. What was also quite striking, and when I've presented this before, lots of people said that these statistics resonate with their experience as practitioners, but almost everyone reported some mental health needs and often also physical health needs. Most of these were linked to depression and anxiety, but also some of the women had diagnosis of bipolar personality disorders, schizophrenia, and so on. And lots of the physical health needs were linked to the mental health needs as well, and the abuse women had experienced. So some of them had broken backs or other physical impairment due to violence and experience previously, trauma-related illnesses, and some of the physical health needs were also linked to substance use, such as the visual impairment, and which again could be probably linked to trauma people had experienced. 14% reported diagnosed or suspected autism and ADHD. 70% were currently or historically using substances, and 70% had children, although only 4 of the women had children currently in their care, and 1 woman was pregnant at the time of the interview. Also, again here, that doesn't necessarily mean that the high number of women who didn't have children in their care anymore, that they all had their children removed into the local authority, although it was quite common for that to happen, but it could also just be that they were older and not living with them anymore. So my findings were mostly around 2 themes: the normalization of violence that already mentioned, of the cyclical and recurring nature of violence and responses by criminal justice and statutory or services in general being quite dismissive, and then how women coped by using relationships to deal with the violence. And I'm specifically going to look at family, romantic relationships, friendships, associates, communities, and then how practitioners sometimes served as so-called bridging capital, trying to or providing a social network that they may not have otherwise. So for the first finding, as I mentioned, the sexual, domestic and physical violence was not only prevalent, it was also quite recurring and cyclical, which then led to entrenched vulnerability to exploitation. Some of the women mentioned how they, for example, achieved periods of stability, and then when asked what happened then, they often spoke about another incident of sexual assault or rape, domestic abuse and violence, which then led to them getting back in, or leading back into homelessness or using substances to self-medicate and so on. And I think what often had an worse impact of the way that they then sought help was that these experiences of violence were often not validated and listened to, neither by the people close to them. There were some dismissive responses from family, even when they were younger and exposed to some sort of violence, but also the services when they were, for example, reporting it to the police or trying to get help through housing, which then in the long term led to the underreporting of violence they were subjected to. So they mentioned in the interviews often how they were met with disbelief and stigma and scrutiny for the experiences of violence. And in the example Zaira here, for example, we can see how these experiences often were again informed also by people's race and ethnicity, as in Zaira's case here, where experiences of violence were then projected to her community, which led the police officer in that case to just look away and not help her with her abusive partner. But it was also sometimes informed by mental health and motherhood, meaning when for example, in maybe the second example, where the second quote here makes this a bit clearer, that was often when women experienced violence and had children, it often affected affected the way that they were treated in a different way, and they often reported that they were made responsible for the violence they experienced, which again affected the way they were treated by services. And in this case, for example, of Helen, the child protection proceeding, where she felt that her mental health weighted more than the domestic abuse and violence that she had reported against her ex-partner, which led to her child being given in her ex-partner's care. And other women also have reported how like being judged is not a good mother, even before child protection proceedings, or even before decisions were being made, then alter or like change their behavior towards them, and change their motivation of like trying to find ways to seek help, and especially within formal support networks. There's also the problem of often the absence of physical evidence, which I mentioned a little bit in the beginning, that despite the Domestic Abuse and Violence Act not only focusing on physical evidence, but also coercive control, this was often, when women didn't have the physical evidence, it was often a lot harder for them to make themselves heard and get the evidence of domestic abuse and violence counted in when applying for housing assistance, and it often took more time to move into a different accommodation, or when being moved, they were often first moved, which I'm sure you all know, from like across different emergency and temporary housing, which especially when someone was fleeing violence was quite unsuitable, because they had to check in and check out in like hotels, and felt quite unsafe on the streets. So all these kind of like responses and the way they were treated for the violence that they experienced kind of amplified the responsibility for navigating homelessness and violence on their own, as they did not trust services to properly support them. And so I did see, or like I did hear in the interviews, how women try to like reclaim maybe some of the agency by looking at different ways to find support, and often finding other strategies that also led to further exploitation and stigma. I think Emily's quote here is really highlights that quite a lot, how she explains how she was like sexually assaulted and raped on the street, which then led her turning back into sex work, but feeling embarrassed or like feeling the stigma of then going back to engaging with the service, and kind of having to disclose sex working again, and not wanting to engage with the service anymore. Or another example is like Samantha here. She's like saying, it's my problem. Why would I want to sit and tell somebody else about it, who they can either judge me and just walk away and forget about it? Why waste my time? So this kind of reliance on informal networks was quite highlighted in my interviews. As I mentioned earlier, family networks were also often marked by instability, and that was either like spatial or emotional absence. So either the families weren't around or weren't in the country, or emotionally that they just didn't have a good relationship with members of their family. And these relationships I also found fluctuated quite a lot between the interviews. So when I did follow-up interviews, lots of these relationships changed. And some reporters, as I mentioned earlier, were having childhood abuse and having been in care home themselves, all of which are common risk factors for becoming homelessness in later life, and also affected the way that they were seeking help. And given that frequent lack of given the frequent lack of protective family networks, it was often partners in romantic relationships that they felt they could rely on, and they were perceived as more protective and ways to stay safe from sexual assault and violence on the streets. And that's a strategy that other studies, for example, have looked at as well, that especially when rough sleeping or having no housing options, women are often relying on a generally male partner. As we can see in Evie's case here, for example, where she said it's better to stick with one person than being passed around. But also in Betty's example, some of the women told me how male partners were often like very helpful in navigating homelessness, being that one person to trust and like telling them where to like sleep and stay. And in some cases, the relationship did provide some sort of like comfort and connection. And there were also some examples where a positive relationship led to kind of recovery and motivation to seek help. But probably in more of these cases, the relationships turned out to be quite unsafe, violent, and volatile. Or in the example here, also quite coercive and hindering women to access support. And Chloe here described like being very frightened by her partner and frightened to seek help and go to services because her partner may find out where she was. So many of the relationships many of the romantic relationships were quite complex, and so were the decisions to stay or leave. And I think the difficulty is when these like emotional dimensions are completely absent from how we're trying to deal with them in services, and it can also sometimes lead to further exclusion from services. So Betty, for example, which we've seen before, who spoke to me quite positively about her partner. Like when I followed up later, I saw or I heard that her partner had left prison and was giving a restraining order for abusive behavior towards her, but this let him then being barred from a service they attended together, and then led both of them to disengage from the service and frontline staff. So I think it's kind of like thinking about how can we work better with couples, even though when they're in like a risky relationships, to like not further exclude women from services where they may be exposed to even greater violence when there's no CCTV, no frontline staff, and so on. One of the last things before I come to the practitioners is friendships, associates, and communities. And I'd mentioned earlier that many of the women felt quite isolated. Like I'm on my own, just keeping myself to myself, which kind of maybe reflected some of the disconnection they had from trusting and safe relationships. From my observations and interviews, I did find that it was often more complex than this, though, and there were like lots of incidences where they were helped and helped each other, and that was sometimes even to the detriment of their own safety. Two of the participants that I interviewed, one of them stayed with another in her hostel room, which then led her being at risk of eviction because she wasn't meant to have people staying there, even though in that case, the other participant was at risk of being sexually assaulted on the streets. And the women that I interviewed, as well as the practitioners, often distinguish these encounters from friendships and would often like call them associates, which are often more negatively perceived than friendships, I think. And even the women define them as people who expected something in return. And many of the relationships exploited the relationships then financially, emotionally, or sexually. And also here, lots of the women felt that the responsibility for was on them, and that they were choosing the wrong relationships, who would then ask for sexual favors for their support and kind of for sexual favors or like financial reimbursement of them staying somewhere. So while some of these weaker ties, or so-called weaker ties, it just means like acquaintances, people they meet, or people they, for example, who are also sex workers, they often help to like navigate access to information and complex services, and did provide some short-term relief and accommodation, but they also had the potential to quickly change into obligations and exploitations rather than like this more friendly exchange. So again, here the relationships were often limited to actually provide ways out of homelessness. And this was often also a frustration maybe for some of the practitioners who thought that there was the potential for like women to stick together, or like some of the friendships becoming like this motivation for like recovery and building like positive peer networks. But I think what was also important is that even in cases where women mentioned they had a good friend, they often felt they couldn't share the trauma they experienced with them, or it often felt inappropriate or even dangerous. They felt the friends didn't have the professional training or wouldn't be able to relate to them and understand them. And in some cases, like that kind of fear of judgment was also justified, and people felt like, for example, in Magda's case, that when they told them about their experiences, that I never heard from them again, and they were shunted from their like social networks. And again, sometimes this was influenced by other experience, other intersectional dimensions. For example, in Amal's case here, she felt quite uncomfortable when sharing details about the experiences of homelessness and especially abuse with friends who were from her minority cultural background. And in another example, one of the woman felt like her community, or like disclosing to the community, was so unsafe that she decided to just cut all the ties to her community. And again, when like relational abuse is normalized and reinforced by community pressures or the community in general, that can like heighten the risk of leaving like an exploitative situation. And the barriers can feel particularly high because of that notion of like isolation. And so like the last kind of theme is like how practitioners can then kind of become these bridging capitals. And we do know that practitioners, when practitioners are able to build trusting relationships, they can improve people's health outcomes and recovery, and facilitate pathways out of homelessness, and not just through like these basic supports like food banks and day centres and so on, but also to for like helping to access more statutory services for housing and healthcare, and like maybe more sustainable ways out of homelessness. And so the importance of these kind of like more relational dynamics was quite often noted by the women. In Chloe's example here, where she felt like her support worker was one of the only positive relationships she had, and how this kind of like helped her to build up the confidence again and building and believing in herself. But we also know, and especially with the more constrained service environment, that there's often this like tension between the care and control between services, and especially when like with high staff turnover and increasing fragmentation of services and workloads, that often these kind of like the access to these like trusting relationships is coming in exchange for like, I don't know, in exchange for sometimes like privacy or like surveillance or information. It's like in Tamara's case, for example, where she felt it's becoming so fragmented for her to access, and like information's been passed on, or like support worker. Also in her interview, she mentioned how she had been able to build up a trusting relationship with someone, but this person left. All these kind of problems that we know exist and can kind of have negative effects then on the person, and like they're building trust and seeking further support. And even building trusting relationships can have adverse effects when after, like, for example, some time of stability, they start using again, or having another period of homelessness, where because they've been let down in the past so much, they have then feelings of guilt, which leads them to then disengage, not necessarily because the response of the practitioners would be difficult or would be negative, but because they've made this experience in the past, that once things don't turn out well, that they often explained how it was then difficult to come back. And I think I mentioned that, like, high staff turnover, high workloads, left some of the women feel quite abandoned, and their trust in the system eroded. And I think here's also where we could see some of the gendered expectations around, like, being potentially more emotional and being smiley or fine, were often judged as coping and dismissed as undeserving or not eligible or discharged, and could also their responsibilities they had in the past. For example, if they had a family, if they had dependent children and were doing fine, and like the change in social care assessments, for example, too, that it's not just the substance use, but the trauma and things like that. Practitioners explained that it's often been quite difficult to being more difficult to make the point for women how their mental health, physical health, and so on has changed. And I think Vanessa's quote here shows it quite well, of like being like taking care of other people and taking care of themselves, like looking quite happy-go-lucky and smiley as a facade. But then people often think, oh, they're right, they're fine, they're smiling. So as a conclusion, I think those coping mechanisms are often shaped by the responsibility women are feeling, but also a desire maybe for like more connection and dependence. And I think the findings showed some of the complexity of the social relationships and the impact of structural power dynamics, which were impacted by like layers of abuse, often several sources of abuse, the compound trauma, but also economic deprivation and other intersectional dimensions that often limited transforming participants' structural realities more sustainably, and led to them like developing these like more relational coping mechanisms, which were again quite precarious in themselves, and even options perceived as safer were often exploitative and unsafe. And I think nevertheless, a lot of the women showed like quite resilience, or like trying to survive through like those different options that were available to them, and sadly, I think like lots of these relational components where women were able to like find ways out of homelessness and recovery were often dismissed, or like did not get like that much of like an emphasis, such as like the relationships they were able to build with support workers, or like peer support groups, or when they had a supportive partner. Or in some cases, also reconciliation with family members, improved motivations. And so I think that the next slide is going to get more about like the recommendations, but I think maybe thinking about ways how we can kind of improve these social connections maybe, and like focus more on these and like building long-term relationships, not just as practitioners, but then also like reconnecting into like community and building more social networks. And then I think the findings also show like how practitioners then, when being able to build a trusting relationships, can serve as like replacement for lacking when people lack these relationships. But again, as like services become more under pressure, there's likely going to be more shift away from person-centered approaches and more like bureaucratic, inflexible approaches that and lots of the women like mentioned how like they felt like seeing as a number, but I don't think that's necessarily gender specific. It's probably across the system that people feel like quite being treated as numbers rather than as persons. The majority of the women had never had access to any adequate support for when they reported the violence. So neither from the criminal justice system, nor did they have any like trauma or emotional support afterwards. And then what I mentioned earlier, like the exclusion of like couples, so even when they're exploited, potentially like undermines the few forms of like trust that is available to them, and also disregards the normalization of violence that has occurred previously, and why it may be difficult to leave such a relationship in the context they're in. So generally, I think I was just hoping to describe how like the dynamics are often reinforced by cycles of traumatic experiences, and how they often prevent meaningful ways then out of homelessness. And yeah, as I said, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the study also focuses on a particular group of women who are at high risk of violence and exploitation, and it's primarily within heterosexual relationships. So there is a need to kind of look more look more into these intersectional dimensions, such as like when women are with a disability or long-term chronic health conditions, when they're identifying as LGBTQ+, where we don't know or understand yet how like these experiences can shape their experience of gender-based violence and trauma when being homeless. And yeah, so my last slides, and I hope we can like discuss this a bit more than in the discussion. But I'd like to hear from you as practitioners what you think about the recommendations and how we could like incorporate them into practice. I think, I mean, I don't want to say too much about the first two because we all know that we need more resources, more multidisciplinary responses, and there's and more appropriate crisis interventions from police and domestic sexual abuse agencies when women report the violence, regardless, and whether they're homeless, whether they're experiencing multiple needs and so on. And we do need more gender-appropriate housing options, which include refugees, sanctuaries, housing first, and family units. Also specialist units where low thresholds and specialist units where maybe like women that we're currently not reaching, who are like in exploitative relationships or who are in crack houses and so on, can be more accessible. And then trying to think about how can we make these spaces also accessible for women from ethnic minority backgrounds, identifying as LGBTQ+, and women with additional needs when using substances who are, for example, often shunned from refuges at the moment, or when they're experiencing additional mental health problems when being disabled and so on. And so I think the focus on like the recommendations now is maybe like how can we provide more relational responses to homelessness that is more accessible, and yeah, like a greater focus on non-material or relational approaches through, for example, lower caseloads that enable practitioners to build trusting relationships and offer more flexibility. And maybe also avoid like discharging when eligibility criteria are not further met, and then that one like trusting relationship is basic vanishes. And then thinking about like how can we find better, or how can we create safer service and temporary housing options for couples to ensure like the safety of both partners, while also dealing with the risk that services and taking on for like potentially exploitative relationships. And then we do know obviously schemes like peer mentoring and support are very important. So thinking about ways how we can incorporate them more into services and making them effective. I think I'm going to stop there so we have like more time for the discussion. Let me know if anything was unclear. This may be a bit less structured in the end. So do let me know if you have any questions, anything that you want me to go over again, and any thoughts that you have on the recommendation and findings.
Someone's just put in the chat that they thought the research was great, Carolin.
Thank you.
Yeah, lots of comments about it being really interesting and lots to absorb. Was there anything in particular that you wanted people's feedback on or thoughts? Any particular points?
Yeah, I'd be really curious to hear about like what recommendations are like, or how that the findings resonate with your practice. And I think I've not mentioned it now, but like there's one toolkit, for example, the Connecting People one that I think is quite interesting and has been used in like the mental health services. It has been used in mental health services more than homes. I don't think it has been used in homelessness services, but it's about basically mapping out the connections that people have and how they would like to reconnect with certain people, like what they kind of want, more like talking about relationships and how they want them to like look like and so on. So like, yeah, a greater focus on the emphasis of these relational aspects, which I think is just, yeah, it just came across like very strongly that there is often that like hope for like reconnecting to some sort of like, which we know why like peer mentoring and peer groups are working so well, because that's like a space where people feel understood and are able to build like a relationship that is positive and supportive. Yeah, so I'd be curious if you have any thoughts on that.
I think everyone's been unmuted now, so or has their microphones enabled. So if anyone does want to speak, then they just need to unmute themselves. Anyone's got anything to comment or reflect, or any questions for Carolin?
I've been talking too much.
I think there's just a lot of information there, isn't there? And
yeah,
like people have commented, there's lots of, yeah, it's really interesting, but lots of things to take on board, isn't there? I don't think any. Oh, we've got a question. Sam, can you, if you unmute yourself, can you speak? Can you?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, it was just really, really interesting research and obviously really important. I was just wondering, it's not, I suppose it's not specifically related to your findings, but have you got any plans on kind of disseminating the research, obviously, once you're graduated and all of that, and like any policy impact stuff that you're planning on doing? Or yeah, just interested because like I'm doing my PhD as well, so
yeah,
you're just a few years ahead of me.
yeah. No, that's a really good question, and I just had a discussion. I was at a conference yesterday, where I presented some of that as well, and where I also had the discussion of like, oh, I'm still at this like summarizing all the findings stage and then thinking about how can we then turn them in some practical recommendations. And I did have, I should have mentioned that for the recommendation, I do have an advisory group which does include people with lived experience and practitioners. So they have also been like helpful in shaping some of the recommendations. But I think I'm not, I'm still thinking about how we can make these more practical, especially I'm a bit opposed always on this like idea of like how can we like improve practice even more when I do know that resources are more and more difficult to obtain. So trying to like navigate both of that, like trying to not put more pressure on practitioners, but also I don't know, keep thinking about like the more structural barriers that provide like more meaningful ways out of this. But yeah, if you have any great ideas, Sam, that are coming out of your research, I know you focus more on the criminal justice side of things, but yeah, it would be great to hear about what you come across.
I currently have no thoughts and just PhD stress, but I will definitely keep in touch.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Sam and Carolin. So we've got another question from Sandra. Are you able to?
Yes, hello. On the on the question of low-level support that's that's accessible, have you come across circles at all? Circles of support. They're kind of restorative relational practice interventions. I know I'm asking because I know that in some areas people are trialing it. and it's very effective in other domains of suffering and violence. And if you have come across them, where 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 do they take place, or even better, given that there's there's a very tiny element of proof of concept that is available, which I'd happily share with you. But yes, where could such circles of support take place, like peers supporting, but more in a discursive and emotional support way? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I've not come across circles of support specifically, so I'd be happy to receive more references and studies about it. But I've been thinking that's like maybe not directly related to your question now, because that was more about peer mentoring and support. But I've been coming across like some places where like people were trying to like get these like more low threshold engagement with someone who is like currently not engaging because they're in an abusive setting, they're like in crack houses and so on. So what I did come across, but I need to look a bit more into it, I think, is that often even when they were not letting when they were in a cohesive relationship, for example, and not letting women engage with like more substantial support, they were often like still like going to certain low threshold services, such as like collecting scripts or sexual health services and so on. And there's been like studies around, and I know this may seem like very idealistic again, but like safe injection sites and safe smoking sites, where then these women are able to go there and like start like coming out of like that these like relationships where they're isolated and often in like coercive setting. So I think these are quite interesting to think about. How can we like start reaching them and then later trying to engage with them. But yeah, about the support, the peer support, I think there should be like, and I think where they have been implemented, they seem to be working quite well, and that's what you hear quite a lot as well, that they do want to hear from people that can relate to them, and I think it's also that like space where it's not always about their needs, it's not always seeing them as a problem, but it's where they can just be a person and like just be in a friendly space sitting together.
Sorry, if I can come back on that.
Yeah.
It seems to me that the problem with peer support is that that's a one-to-one position, which is places a huge burden on that one peer supporter. Whereas I think the circle idea of shared experience and shared burdens, etc., can diffuse that to a certain extent. But the problem, I think, in the very outreach context, it's where and how the necessary training and so on can take place to make those gatherings happen. It's a beautiful idea, and yes, I'd be very happy to share. It's all being built at the moment, if you see what I mean. So the foundations are being built. So there's not very much I can specifically point you at, but it is something in development.
Yeah, it sounds really, really interesting. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra and Carolin. There's just a couple of questions about the findings and sort of publishing them. So are you intending to formally publish the findings? And then when your research is published, could this be shared with attendees?
Yeah, so I published, I think one of the slides is a QR code. So there's one that I've popped, but it's a systematic review, meaning that it's just kind of like looking at all the literature that has been published on the topic of how different intersectional dimensions, meaning like being a mother, being from an ethnic minority group, being identifying as LGBTQ plus, and so on, impacts people's or women in particular, help seeking and access to support. So that's one. I think it's this one. Then the relationship one. I'm just finishing the write-up of it and tweaking the recommendations. Again, thinking about more like practical implications, and then that will hopefully be published as well. And then the next step is I'm currently thinking a lot about perceptions of vulnerability and risks and how they are applied across different services and the impact this has on how women are accessing support and services. But I'd be more than happy to share anything that is published when it's published, but it may be taking a very long time. But yeah, please share like your email and I'd be happy to get back in touch once I've got something.
Thank you, Carolin. Sandra?
Yes, sorry, I was going to say, how should I get things to you? Do you have an email, please?
Yeah. Yes, I'll share with you in the chat.
Sorry, one other thing. There's an event soon, I can't think when, where I believe it's in Oxford or Cambridge. There's a police event on one of these things. If I can find that, shall I send you the link?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay.
Any resources are very welcome.
Okay. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was just going to read a couple of these comments out, Carolin, from the chat box as well. So someone's written, I think connecting with women with other opportunities is a really helpful suggestion. We've sometimes found women benefit from volunteering at other charities, and giving back to others has really helped with confidence and building connections with others, although challenging to maintain their involvement. There's another one here. It says, I think services struggle to work with the whole person, and yes, with a limited amount of time, collaboration and sharing information for further external support is difficult. I think, and I don't know how you pronounce this, is it Bordeaux Clive concept? I'm not sure about my pronunciation there, so I apologise for that. When reintegrating into the family following homelessness is difficult. Sorry, I've just lost my place now. Scroll down. It's difficult with a disconnect in relationship and openness about experience, which is sometimes sorry, every time I go down, I lose my space. Ongoing difficulties which unresolved and independency coping strategies do not match with service recommendations and understanding. I think this is in conflict with women's responsibilities such as parenting to and building relationships. Another one here about really interesting research. I'm very interested in women's views on how we can support women better in refuges when they're experiencing severe multiple disadvantage and what this provision may look like. Communal can be a struggle to manage, but self-contained units can be isolating. Getting the balance right is tricky, particularly balancing the needs of other women and children in communal spaces. I would be really interested to read more. Thank you.
Yeah, I think here it's also like, I think it's very, well, I think it's just about people's choices a lot as well. That for some, like self-contained units are great, for others like more communal spaces, and just having not that choice and having the lack of housing and specialist places, especially when it's compounded with like other needs. That is the difficult part of then, trying to like fit everyone into the same shoe kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you, Carolin. Has anyone got anything else that they wanted to contribute to the session? Otherwise, if not, we'll just finish a little bit early. Is that a new hand, Sandra, or an old hand?
It's an old one, sorry.
That's okay. Okay.
I think maybe just briefly to Sarah's comment, there's been interesting studies, especially with regards to women's motherhood and how that is kind of changing, or how that is often difficult then to how there's often a tension between what services require from them and like their parenting responsibilities and gender responsibilities of like caring for their children and so on. There's quite, I can look up the studies. There's been some really interesting work in that area.
Thanks, Karen. If you have got any links or anything you want to send through afterwards, and we can include them in the follow-up email if there's things that you'd like to share. Amelia.
Thanks, Justine. Just thinking about what we were saying about self-contained being isolating and communal being a bit much for some people. What's your opinion on the integration of activities into homelessness provisions? So, for example, having communal eating spaces, having organised activities that could bring people together, even if they are living in those self-contained units.
I think, I mean, again, I think it's about people's choices a little bit. So not everyone will like the communal activities, but I do think they're important, and I think they're often the first things that are being cut. So lots of like, I don't know, temporary housing or something when they were offering garden activities and like some more community events, they're often the first ones being cut because there's like often not a big number of people using them. But I think there's still the importance of them being there when anyone wants to access them. So I think that would be the same for me for like self-contained flats. I think that they are really important, and I think the less time and resources we have, the less of an emphasis are on these kind of spaces. Does that answer your question? Don't know.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's sad that these kind of more holistic things get cut, particularly when we're thinking about meals. Like a lot of hostels used to provide a meal a day, and that's all been cut largely. And eating is just a great way to bring people together, but also really important for nutrition.
Yeah, I agree. I think Sandra may have a new hand now. Is that still a legacy hand?
Yeah, it's a new hand, and then sorry to bore on, but could you just? I put a link in the chat to what I think is the booking page for the event on the listening circles, and it's police and community. Well, I mean, because it's kind of a restorative justice practice, the police love to get involved. but my dream is for it to be community-led, and so but that's the most publicly available piece of information that I have about it, if you want to know, and if others might be interested in booking and joining up to see what it's about. Honestly, I think it really needs developing, and if you are in a position to go to these places where women gather, women in need gather, and can become I know the catalyst to bring these kind of circles into those spaces, not putting anything, no pressure, but it would be marvelous.
It does sound like a really good event, and I'll try to go there and see them and observe them. I do think that not everyone liked the idea to be in like groups of people.
Yes.
I think for what came across as well, that was often these like one-on-one relationships that people really valued, rather than like being in like group discussions. They often felt like quite unsafe in them. Not everyone, obviously, and for some this was really valuable. But I think, I think there's also this like we need to think more about how can we like develop these like very trusting one-to-one relationships, and not just like more group settings. But I do really like the event.
Thank you for that. Thank you I think we're finished there if no one's got anything else that they'd like to comment or reflect on. So thank you very much, Carolin, for presenting today. And thanks everybody for your contributions and questions.